I've made 3 videos on Isaiah 53, a passage which some Christians believe to be a prophecy about Jesus Christ. I've also written a comprehensive article for my website with all of the content from my videos, plus more, and yet I repeatedly get comments from Christians who still fail to understand the reading that I propose, often becoming lost amidst the various pronouns in the text. In this video I will follow the narrative of Isaiah 53 step by step, to illustrate just how it should be read. But first let me emphasize that this is not just my interpretation, and it's certainly not a unique or foreign interpretation. Most Jews accept that Israel is the suffering servant, and this seems to have been the case at least as far back as the early church father Origen reported it around the 3rd century CE. Most biblical scholars, especially of ancient Hebrew scripture, also accept the Israel interpretation. In fact, many of said scholars are Christians, some even evangelical and conservative Christians, and there are still many other Christians who are not scholars who also accept this view of Isaiah 53. And as we'll see throughout this video, there are good reasons why so many people recognize Israel as the servant, while only select Christians will advocate a reading that claims Jesus to be the servant. Beginning with verse 1, we read, "Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" Immediately it should become clear that we need some context to the passage. Who is speaking? Who is the hour? In verse 2 we read of a he, a person, that grew up before God like a tender shoot. Who is this person? We need to know our speaker and the subject, who is talking and who they are talking about. To find the answer we have to go back in the text. The book of Isaiah did not originally have chapter divisions, but even aside from this, we cannot just read Isaiah 53 alone if we want to understand it properly, because we would have no real idea of who the speaker and the subject are, and so thus we turn back to Isaiah 52. Let's take a moment to talk about this chapter. In Christian exegesis of Isaiah 53, chapter 52 is rarely mentioned. Yet as part of the surrounding context, it helps to give us an idea of themes, language, and historical elements dealt with in this portion of Isaiah. Most scholars separate chapters 1 through 39 of Isaiah from chapters 40 through 66, because of those 3 aspects of the text. Some additionally separate chapters 40 through 55 from 56 through 66, but what's important for our purposes is understanding that Isaiah 53 belongs to a time period that is more distant from the first few dozen chapters of the book, according to textual scholarship. And when we read Isaiah 52, we can see why they think this. The very first 2 verses emphasize the impending liberation of Israel, referred to both as Zion and Jerusalem. "The uncircumcised and defiled will not enter you again," reads verse 1. "Free yourself from the chains on your neck, daughter Zion, now a captive." In verse 3 we find God declaring that Israel was sold for nothing, and yet they will be redeemed without money. In verse 4 we find a recollection of 2 of the oppressors of Israel, Egypt and Assyria. By 721 the northern kingdom of Israel had fallen under Assyrian rule, and Judah soon became a vassal state of the empire. Then in the late 7th century Assyria was conquered by Babylon, and the Israelites were deported to Babylon around 587 BCE. Isaiah 52:5 has God declare that "My people have been taken away for nothing, and those who rule them mock them." Here we see a clear message of both foreign captivity and innocence on the part of Israel. Though Israel has been taken away by a nation that mocks them, they have done nothing to deserve it. The oppression of the Assyrians in verse 4 is also called "without cause" in translations like the New American Standard and New King James Version, but the NIV interestingly omits the phrase with no notation or explanation. So there is the distinct idea that Israel was innocent before its captors, something recognized by God himself, who gives the discourse in verses 3 through 6. The next 6 verses stress how the Israelites long for God's deliverance and the opportunity to return home. Verse 10 promises that the Lord will lay bare his holy arm in the sight of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God. The Persian king Cyrus the Great is depicted as an anointed one of the Lord in Isaiah 45, 1 through 3, and he eventually ends the exile and allows the Jews to rebuild Jerusalem. The praise of Cyrus in Hebrew scripture points to the likelihood that the author of Isaiah was writing during the time of the Persian king, who had probably made his intentions known, and yet just before the return to Jerusalem, as the expectant and anticipatory mood of Isaiah 52 seems to support. Verses 11 and 12 encourage the Israelites to remain pure and faithful when they will finally leave for Jerusalem. Then we find a seemingly sudden change in tone with the last 3 verses, 13 through 15, of Isaiah 52. "See, my servant will act wisely, he will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Here we find the he continued into the next chapter, but whose servant is this? Biblical scholar Jeremy Shipper notes that the majority scholarly opinion on the structure of Isaiah 53 is that it is divided into three parts. A divine speech or oracle makes up the introduction and conclusion, and the main body of the text is a psalm about the servant. Thus in Isaiah 52:13-15, God is the speaker, which may also be observed from the promise to lay bare his holy arm in the sight of all the nations in verse 10, as well as the remark in verse 12 about the Lord going before Israel as their rear guard. This device of a divine speech later returns for the conclusion in Isaiah 53:11-12, but God is not the speaker of the first 10 verses of chapter 53, otherwise he is awkwardly referring to himself in the third person. To find out who is speaking in that portion of the text, we need to look back to the last 3 verses of chapter 52 again. God speaks of his servant who is marred in appearance and considered astonishing or appalling. Verse 15 states that he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told they will see, and what they have not heard they will understand. Coming on the heels of a passage that covers the Israelites longing to be freed from captivity and their experience of oppression from foreign rulers, it's not difficult to see that this oracle is a promise to set things right. The Gentile kings and nations will be shown the error of their ways, how they mocked, tormented, and defiled a people that had done nothing to deserve it. So it is these kings and rulers who are the speaker of Isaiah 53:1-10, lamenting their treatment of Israel as they see what they were not told and understand what they did not hear. The question of to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed in the first verse is likely a callback to Isaiah 52:10 with the promise that God will lay bare his holy arm in the sight of all the nations. In Isaiah 53, the nations witness the arm of the Lord delivering Israel from oppression. It's important to note that Isaiah 53 is also the last of 4 servant songs found in the book of Isaiah. In these other songs we find additional confirmation that Israel is the servant and the Gentiles are his oppressors. You are my servant Israel, in whom I will display my splendor, we read in Isaiah 49:3. In 49:6, God promises to make Israel a light for the Gentiles, emphasizing the servant's role in showing the nations the error of their ways. The suffering of the servant is often tied into the suffering of Jesus, but there is much more immediate relation to the suffering of the Israelites under Babylonian captivity, and this also seems to make more sense of the feeling of a distant God, expressed in verses like Isaiah 52:8 and 53:4. In much of Hebrew scripture, Israel considers foreign oppression to be the result of their own unfaithfulness to God, and the Gentiles are seen as instruments of divine wrath. We find this familiar sentiment in Isaiah 47. Speaking to the queen city of the Babylonians, God says, I was angry with my people and desecrated my inheritance. I gave them into your hand. However, the passage then takes a different turn as God reproaches the Babylonians. You showed them no mercy. Even on the aged you laid a very heavy yoke. You said, I am forever the eternal queen, but you did not consider these things or reflect on what might happen. So according to the text, the Gentiles overstepped their permission to punish Israel, and thus God will show them the error of their ways by showing them how they have mistreated his people and how he will yet redeem them. A fair way of understanding the Isaiah 53 passage is by realizing that single male pronouns like he, his, and him refer to Israel, the suffering servant, and plural pronouns like we, our, and us refer to the Gentile nations. This means that when Isaiah 53:5 says, He was pierced for our transgressions, He was crushed for our iniquities, what we are reading is the Gentile kings contemplating how Israel was punished for their sins. Of course, according to this interpretation, the piercing and crushing that is described is only metaphor for the harsh treatment of Israel during the exile. Isaiah 53 is abundant with poetic language, and even Christians who interpret Christ as the servant consent that crushed for our iniquities is metaphor, as Jesus was never literally crushed in any tradition. The remarks in verses 7-9 about the servant never opening his mouth, uttering deceit, or committing violence during oppression and affliction are likely another callback to the preceding chapter, with Israel being sold for nothing and taken away for nothing while being mocked by their oppressors. In verse 10, God is introduced once more, and the servant's suffering is indicated to be divine will. For the final 2 verses of the chapter, God describes the rewards he will bestow upon Israel for enduring the hardship. In the next chapter, 54, we find the restoration of Israel is again the subject. The first 10 verses address a barren woman, which is a probable reference to Israel, still devastated after the Babylonian conquest. Verses 11 through 17 refer to the afflicted city, Jerusalem, and how God will rebuild it with precious stones and establish a righteous kingdom there once more. Thus, in the chapters before and after Isaiah 53, we find the theme of God delivering Israel from foreign rule. On the Jesus interpretation, we are asked to ignore that context and suppose that Isaiah 53 refers to a figure that, from the writer's time, is nearly 600 years into the future. The confusing absurdity of God incarnate becoming a servant to himself is also an issue. Most objections to the Israel interpretation seem to center around Christian theology. On multiple occasions I've had Christians tell me that Israel can't be the servant because Israel was not sinless. However, this passage doesn't actually support the notion that the servant is sinless. This misconception looks like it comes from verse 9, where the servant is said to have done no violence and spoken no deceit. While Israel obviously committed violence in the past and spoke some deceit, the verse makes it clear that the servant committed no violence or deceit against the oppressors. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence. This merely means that the servant's punishment was undeserved. The reading of sinlessness comes only from projecting Christian theology onto the text. Yet it needs to be pointed out that even if the passage is taken as a messianic prophecy, there is still next to nothing in it that hints at Jesus Christ. Try reading the chapter as if you've never heard of Jesus before. What do we learn about the servant? He is despised by others, familiar with suffering, innocent before his oppressors, and used for a divine purpose. You might say that the grave with the rich is a reference to Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, and although I disagree, I'll grant you it for the sake of argument. What then do we have that identifies this suffering servant as Jesus? At most, one measly and disputable thing. There is no mention of Nazareth, disciples, Pilate, miracles, sermons, or any of the obvious and notable characteristics of the gospel stories. Without even knowing the accurate interpretation of the text, we should be able to see that Jesus just doesn't fit. There are few to no descriptive details that point to him. There are some bits about the offspring and prolonging of days in verse 10 that contradict the story of Jesus. Then there is the past tense rendering of the passage, which works strongly against the idea that the chapter prophesies a man 600 years into the future. But now that I've laid out a fairly straightforward examination of the text, including historical context along with support from the surrounding passages and other portions of Isaiah, hopefully this interpretation is easier to grasp. I don't doubt that there will still be some who deny its claims, but unless they are able to soundly refute the arguments here and support their own interpretation with an equal body of evidence, we have no reason to think that their denial is based on anything but religious bias. Isaiah 53 is part of an important text for the Jewish people because of how it preserves their history during a time when they had experienced great suffering, and yet a glimmer of hope could be seen on the horizon. And for Christians, the passage can still be valuable even without the Jesus interpretation, since it stresses the faithfulness of God to deliver his followers from oppression, as well as the idea that the wicked can be made to see the error of their ways. Not only is the Israel interpretation more accurate in light of the evidence, but it seems richer in content, too, tying together history, theology, and scripture. A reading that neglects these things, relies on assumptions, has various contradictions, and demonstrates a very fervent bias is necessarily an inferior one.